Brain Banter is a podcast about the goings-on of Columbia University neuroscience professors and the stories behind who they are, how they got to where they are, and the motivations and explanations behind their research. My name is Aly Lab, and I'm your host. On the show today is Dr. Miriam Aly, a member of the Department of Psychology at Columbia University. She investigates perception, attention, and memory at the Aly Lab. From memory-enhancing tips, an unexpected career, to mental health advice, this episode covers it all. Let's jump in. Thank you so much for coming in today. I'm really excited. What I want to start off with is, I want to start at the beginning. So how did you get into psychology?
Sure, yeah, it's a great question. So I had a bit of a roundabout way of getting there. I'll start when I was a kid because that's when I discovered a fascination with some psychology-related concepts and particularly visual illusions. So when I was a kid, my mom bought me a book from the library that was filled with visual illusions, and I thought it was, the best thing I'd ever seen, and I was really obsessed with it. So that's when I think I started being interested in things like perception, and I did a class project on whether being left-handed or right-handed predicted whether somebody was more left-brained or right-brained. And of course, now I know that left-right-brained things are mostly a myth. But I think I had started to form an interest in psychology-related concepts at a young age, but I didn't know what psychology was. I was just interested in those kinds of things. But I thought psychology was counseling. I didn't know that psychology was, experimental research related to the mind and brain. So when I applied to college, I applied thinking maybe I do pre-med or maybe I do bio. And I went to college expecting to do those things. And in my first year, I had to take a psych class as a required course for my major. And that's when I realized what psychology was. And on day one, I decided that I wanted to change my major to psychology because I really loved the intro psych class that I was taking. So I called my mom and told her, actually, I don't think I want to go to med school. I think I want to major in psych. And she was very concerned, very alarmed, not sure if it was the best life choice for me. But that's when I was very confident at that point that psychology was something I was very interested in. I had no concept of careers in psychology whatsoever at that point in time, but I knew that I was fascinated by the material.
So do you remember anything specific from intro psych that piqued your interest?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I just discovered that it was a study of the brain and the mind. And I didn't know that before because I thought psychology was therapy and counseling. So I didn't realize that there was a way that you could do experiments to understand people's memory and perception. I just had no idea. So I think it was just that realization that this was a science that you could do and that you could answer questions like, why do these visual illusions happen? And why do people remember some things and not other things?
So just to keep going on your path of academia, I saw that you went to university in Canada as well as the US. I also did. I went to McGill.
Oh, cool.
And then I transferred. So I'm just interested, what was your experience in academia in different countries? I guess undergraduate's a little different. And why did you choose to end up studying in the US?
Sure. Yeah, so I was born and raised in the US, and my mom had been a grad student when I was growing up, so she was trying to get her PhD, but it is very difficult to get a PhD while supporting two kids as a single mom. So at some point, it became clear that she wouldn't be able to finish her PhD. She had some master's degrees, but decided at that point that it was best to move to industry. And she was not an American citizen. She moved here from Egypt. And it is really difficult for people who are not American citizens to get some jobs in the US. So we moved to Canada for job prospects. It was easier for her to become a Canadian citizen than an American citizen. So we moved to Canada when I was in high school. And so one of the main reasons I stayed in Canada was we could not afford out-of-state tuition for American schools. It was just way too expensive and we didn't have the money. And Canada, very luckily, for Canadians and everybody else is their higher education system is very affordable, as you know, compared to the United States. So that was actually one of the main reasons, but obviously the Canadian schools in the area were excellent, and the University of Toronto was a place that I felt had all of the programs and all of the classes that I could be interested in. And conveniently, my older brother was attending University of Toronto as well. So all those together made it an easy choice. And my mom was living in Ottawa, which was, a few hours away. So that's why I stayed in Canada. And then for grad school, where I discovered you don't have to pay, that was also something I didn't know. It was easy for me to go back to the US because an expense wasn't so much of an issue.
Thanks for sharing that. Now we're going to move on to your lab, I think. Can you tell me about the research you're doing with perception and memory formation?
Sure. So I'm very interested in both perception and memory. So I kind of alluded to that with my illusions example. And when I went to undergrad, I formed an interest in people's real life memories and why there are some things that we might remember from a random childhood incident, and yet we forget things that happened, a couple of weeks ago. So I became really interested in memory. So I went to grad school with an intention to study memory in populations that have amnesia. So what's their memory loss like? What kind of memories do they retain? What are strategies that might help them remember? And kind of accidentally, I started doing some perception research in these patients with amnesia because a grant reviewer wanted us to make sure that their impairments were selective to memory and not to perception. And so that actually, it opened a can of worms in something that was really interesting, which is that at the time, research was coming out that showed that actually patients with amnesia do have perceptual problems. So that if you damage the brain's memory systems like the hippocampus, you actually can have problems with your visual perception. And that at the time was an opening area of research that was suggesting that the brain is not neatly divided along perceptual systems and memory systems, but the same systems can contribute to both perception and memory. So that really had a big impact on me. And it was very interesting for me to think about how the brain is not divided into these separate modules, but that a given system can contribute to both your perception and your memory. And so I carried that forward through my PhD and my postdoc work and now my lab, where we're really interested in understanding how the brain's so-called memory systems can actually be useful in directing our attention and influencing our perception and influencing predictions that we make about the future.
Very cool. So what immediately jumps to mind, I'm trying to differentiate memory and perception.
Sure.
Can you define perception a little more?
Sure. So these boundaries are very blurry, but I think for convenience, we usually think of perception as your sensation and interpretation of things that are in front of you or around you. And memory is the persistence of that information over time, so that when it's no longer in front of you, you're still able to bring to mind details about what it was. So looking at a face in front of you would be perception, but being able to recall details of a person's face in a minute, 5 minutes, or a year or 10 years, that would be memory.
So what kind of factors influence perception?
Oh, that's a big question. I could be here for an hour talking about that, but it's in general, you could think of perception as being influenced by at least two factors. So there's the information in front of you. So it's the stimuli being received by your sensory receptors, whether they're receptors in your eyes or your ears or on your skin, and then your expectations or your knowledge. So, for example, with vision, it's not that you just open your eyes and everything around you makes sense. Your brain actually has to learn to interpret what's around you. So if someone is blind and acquires vision in adulthood, they don't just open their eyes and suddenly see the world the way that you or I would. Their brain actually has to learn to interpret the signals that it's getting. So at a very simplified level, you could think that perception is a product of both the stimuli that your nervous system is receiving and what it's learned to expect.
So it sounds like we have kind of subconscious control over how we perceive things just based off of how we grew up or like our ideologies.
Yeah, so your brain has expectations that you may not be conscious of that influence the way that you see things. So one example that I commonly teach is that over your life, you'll learn that light usually comes from above, because usually our light fixtures are on the ceiling and the sun is above us. And so that type of inference is used by your brain to make sense of the shape of things, because we assume that things that are illuminated have light coming from above. And so we use that heuristic to figure out the shapes of things. So that's a simple example, but there's lots of other examples of how your brain takes what it learns over time and uses that to make inferences about what things look like or how big or small they are, how far away they are, and things like that.
How does your brain decide what's important enough to remember? I'm just thinking, we study so hard for tests and we're like, this is what I need to remember, and the brain doesn't listen. So who's in charge here?
Yeah, so there's lots of things that I think affect what we remember. So things that are salient or emotionally arousing, for example, will tend to be remembered better than things that are neutral or mundane. Things that are personally relevant to us will tend to be remembered better. Things that we're paying attention to are going to be things that we remember better. So there are general principles where we know that there's a lot of factors like emotion and attention that influence what we remember. But there's lots of unexplained things as well. So like I mentioned earlier, a lot of us have these memories for like really mundane things that happen in our lives, and we don't know why we remember them. So, I was talking to a student in my class about this, I think on Monday, and one example that I remembered is I remember being 7 and sitting in 3rd grade and having my teacher walk by. And like, why do I remember that? Like, it's not important, it's not meaningful, it's just like a random event, and yet I remember it. And I realized I also remember the perfume of some of my teachers in elementary school, because at one point I walked by like a shop that had the same smell, and then I was transported back to being 5 years old. So there's lots of things that we remember that don't seem obviously significant, and I think there's a lot of interest, but it's still kind of a puzzle of figuring out why there are some things that stick with us that are not that important, and yet we can't forget other things that seem to be way more significant. So like things that you're studying for a test.
Right. How do you test and get data in your lab using the visual system in memory?
So pre-COVID, we did all of our experiments in person. So we would program experiments to be run on a computer. So you just have images, pictures, movies, whatever. And we put together programs where people can look at those things on a computer and make responses. Some of our studies use eye tracking. So we might have somebody sit in the lab with an eye tracker and look at where they're looking as they're looking at pictures or whatever. We also have some work using virtual reality. So people are wearing these headsets. This is work with Hannah Tartarstol, who's a grad student with me and Dr. Chris Baldessano. So that's what we mostly did pre-COVID. With COVID, we started to do more studies online, so people can do these in their own home.
And what kind of information do you get from those kinds of tests?
Sure, we got mostly 2 things. We ask them to make judgments. So do you remember this thing or not? Can you recall this thing or not? And then we get how quickly they make that judgment. So we usually have a response, a judgment or a choice that they're making, and then how quickly they make it.
So what's the most surprising thing you found working in your lab?
That's a good question. Okay. I know it. I know an example of a surprising thing. So this is work done by Mansi J. Kumar, who's one of my graduate students. And she was interested in how natural fluctuations in attention influence the way that your memory is structured. So anytime you're in any event, your attention will naturally fluctuate. So sometimes you're paying attention and you're in the zone, And other times you kind of zone out and you're thinking about, what you want to do tonight or your plans for the weekend. And she was interested in how those fluctuations influence the way you organize your memory. So we know that memory is organized by time. So things that you experience together tend to be recalled together. So if you later asked me to remember my day, I might tell you that right before this meeting, at a meeting to talk about a music and memory project, and after this meeting, I have to do some writing. So your memories are kind of structured by time. And so Monsi predicted that when you're in a really good attentional state, your memory should be structured very strongly by time. But when you zone out, maybe your memory is more patchy. So it's not as organized by time. Like you remember little bits and pieces here, but you might be worse at remembering that two things were studied right next to each other. And that really fit in very nicely with lots of research that I'm not going to bore you with, but we had a very strong expectation that when your attentional state is good, that you're going to be more likely to organize your memory in a temporal sequence. And she did at least 4 experiments where she found that that wasn't true, that even when you're in a relatively poor attentional state, your memory is very strongly influenced by time. So even if you're in a bad attentional state, you're making lots of errors, your memory later on is still very structured by time. And that suggested to us that time is a very strong signal for memory. And it's maybe even capable of overcoming kind of lapses in attention.
So by time, just to clarify, do you mean like a sequence of time?
Yep. So time just unfolding, like you do one thing, then you do another thing, then you do something else.
Okay.
And so your memory tends to be structured that way. So you remember things in the order that you did them.
Okay. So if you write out your schedule and you have like a block of time for each event, you would more likely remember it than like a day spent doing whatever.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. You could also think about it like if you were recounting your day to somebody at the end of the day, you would most likely follow the rough order in which you do things. So you wouldn't start in the middle, jump to the morning, and then recall your dinner. We tend to remember things in the sequence in which we experience them.
Okay. So that definitely makes a lot of sense. That example specifically. Mm-hmm. So do you do any research or have you thought about just like ways to improve your memory day by day? And is that important to do?
Yeah, so we're not super focused on like real life strategies, but a lot of our work has implications for that. So Monsi's work, for example, highlights the importance of being in a good attentional state. Some of the work that I've done in the past has also looked at how attention can improve memory. There's lots of work on the links between attention and memory. One of my graduate students, Cheyenne Wakeland-Hart, they're interested in 3 factors that might influence memory. So attention, the emotional state evoked by an image, and the intrinsic memorability of an image. So some things are just more memorable to us than others. So while we're not so focused on like coming up with strategies to improve your memory, understanding which factors predict memory better could help people get a better sense of which things are more likely to remember. So if I pay attention, I'm going to be more likely to remember it. If I find an emotional connection with the material, I might be more likely to remember it. So things like that.
One thing that I'm interested in, where do you see your research right now headed to the future?
Sure. So one great thing about leading a lab is that you can have lots of projects, including some that are maybe not your main line of research, but they're side interests that you pursue. So I'm really grateful to have lots of different things going on, but I'll tell you maybe the 2 main branches of what my lab does, with the understanding that there's lots of side projects that don't like quite neatly fit into those branches. But one of the main things we do is study how memory can guide attention. So we're interested in how you use your past experiences to guide what you pay attention to in a complex world. and how you can have multiple memories that are competing with each other because they're very similar, for example, but you have to be able to figure out what to pay attention to in this scenario and not a very similar but distinct scenario. So, for example, if you're walking down a street, you might have to know that at this particular street, you should avoid a pothole that's on the right. But in a very similar, different street, you have to avoid, this sewer where there's rats coming out, something like that. So you have to have similar memories. You have lots of similar memories in your life, but you have to be able to resolve competition between them to effectively guide your behavior and attention. So one general area is just looking at how memory can guide attention when there's competition going on. And we're also interested in how memory is influenced by factors like attention and evoked emotions. So what are the different factors that influence what we remember and the structure of our memory? So most of my lab is centered on understanding how memory guides attention and how attention and other factors affect memory. We're also developing a line of work looking at how you use memory to generate predictions about the future at multiple time scales. So how can you use your memory to predict what's going to happen in 1 second or 5 seconds or 10 minutes? So those are the general areas of research that we're exploring using behavior as well as eye tracking, studies of patients with amnesia and some pharmacological manipulations as well.
With both of those studies, I know that you said you use like eye tracking, but how do you go about like creating a visual test that will specifically cater whether you'll be able to predict which street has a sewer or pothole?
Mm-hmm. So we usually have sequences of images, like realistic natural life scenes that people are shown. And we either set up a task to have particular structure. So you learn that for this particular scene, you have to pay attention to a particular location. So we like explicitly build in a scene and a particular relevant location that is like highlighted for people. We sometimes also just use sequences of images where there's always a particular structure between them. So you might learn that every single time you see this street, afterwards you'll see this restaurant, and after the restaurant you'll see a beach or whatever. So you could have people learn that when they see a particular image, the next image they see is almost certainly going to appear. And you could also use movies, because after you've watched a movie once, you can predict what's going to happen next. So we either build in temporal structure or we use stimuli that already have temporal structure embedded in them. So like a movie, you watch it once, the second time you see it, you can predict what's going to happen next.
Do you guys have to do any work on animals or like rodents, or is it
all? No, we don't. We only do human work. Yeah. Rodent work, there are actually a few labs that do both human and rodent work. It's really challenging, and I have a lot of admiration for people who do both, but in my lab we do human studies only.
Okay, gotcha. So, okay, one thing that came to mind when you were describing memories competing for each other, I don't know if you've experienced this. I feel like most people have. They might have a memory from their childhood that someone else has described to them, and then you think that you might remember a piece and you kind of fill that in. Mm-hmm. And then you think that's your own memory. Does that apply at all to memory competition?
Yeah, this is sometimes called suggestibility. So the fact that if somebody tells you something or tells you that you should remember that thing, that you sometimes start to incorporate that into your memory, even if you don't remember it yourself personally. So there's a lot of work in general on the ways that memories can be distorted, including like, starting to incorporate events that other people told you about, but that you didn't see yourself, or ways that your current knowledge might bias the things that you remember about your past. So there's definitely lots of ways that memories can be distorted, including the ways that you highlighted.
I think it's crazy that our memories can be so manipulated in a way that we think that something we see is our own, or our perception really influences things. Like, do you have any studies on like how our brain can really trick us? Like, that's perception versus memory. And then how can you trust your memory when you're not sure?
Mhm. Yes, we don't do any of those types of studies in my lab, but I am very familiar with them. I think there's two ways that memories can fail in this scenario. One is if you're not paying attention properly at the moment that something has happened, then you are likely not going to remember it very well. And in those situations, you can have other kinds of information like bias related intrude on your memory. Um, it's also the case that when something very emotional happens, your attention might be so narrowly focused on something salient like a gun or a weapon that you don't actually encode the person who's holding it. It's called a weapons focus because that's what it is. So if your attention narrows on the weapon, you might not be paying attention to the person holding it. And that leaves a lot of room for bias to creep in and distort your memory of the event. Um, there's also cases where you might substitute in a person that you just saw before the event. So if you had just talked to somebody else and then the event happened, and for the event you were focused on like the weapon, the face that might come to mind would be the person that you just talked to, even though they didn't have anything to do with the actual incident. So that could have happened as well. But so we know that there are lots of ways that bias can creep in to affect memory. I will also say, though, that it's not that everything we recall should be treated as if it's distorted necessarily. So there has been some research from Nick Diamond and Brian Levine. They looked at memory for real life situations like going through a museum. And they found that even though people forget a lot, the things they do remember tend to be accurate. So I think it's kind of a tricky spot where we want people to be aware that memories can be distorted, but we also don't want people to think that everything they remember is a lie. So most of the time, our memories are mostly accurate, but we forget a ton of stuff. But there are cases where we can have memories that are distorted. And this can happen in situations under which there's a lot of emotional arousal. And it can happen in cases where there's high stakes, like eyewitness testimony can be wrong. So I think we have to be aware of cases where there can be distortion, but also appreciate that it's not like our memories are totally false. Most of the time, they're pretty accurate.
Gotcha. And on the flip side, just to kind of go backwards, I feel like you could cater towards the fact that emotion helps ingrain your memory. So like you're studying something, it sounds like you're very passionate about, that probably helps you remember. So maybe that's a little bit of motivation for everyone out there.
Yeah, it's way easier to remember things that you're interested in. So if you're studying something that you're able to find some intrinsic curiosity and passion about, that'll probably make it easier for you.
So one thing that we like to do at the end is ask for a piece of advice. I read your blog post about how you're just very open about like taking care of yourself and having a balanced life. You don't have to speak to that at all, but it's just something I want to note that I'm really glad that you spoke out about.
Sure, thanks.
And anyway, I'm just wondering, what is one piece of advice you have for students right now, STEM, psychology, or just general?
Only one piece of advice. I could give
more than one.
Maybe I'll give like an acknowledgement to what you said about mental health, and then I'll give another piece of advice. So and I'm happy to link people to the article I wrote about that if there's any interest. But in situations like college or grad school or your job, it's really easy to get overwhelmed with all the stressors. And I think it's really important to not let that stress take over your life. So finding ways to manage so that you still feel like you're getting time to yourself. So setting boundaries, I think, is really important. Like being able to say, I will not work after, whatever o'clock because I need time to myself, or I will not work on Saturdays because I need time to myself, or I will not answer people's emails at this hour because I need time. So setting boundaries just to protect your space and your time, because if you get to the point where you're not doing that, it is really hard to kind of dig out of it. And taking periodic breaks is going to be better for you and your productivity and mental health in the long run than forcing yourself to work like really intensively for long periods of time. It's just not sustainable. So just like I'd encourage people to set boundaries and always take care of yourself at regular intervals, so you're not pushed in a situation where it's like really hard to dig out of the constant stress and overwork. My second piece of advice is that there's a lot that I didn't know when I was in college. So like I didn't know what psychology was. I didn't know what careers were available as a psychologist. I just didn't know the space of things that I could do. And so I had gravitated to like med school initially because I knew a doctor was a job that was respectable and that my family was like really excited if I did that. And I didn't take time to learn about other opportunities. And I think often when you start college, it's easy to like pick a profession because it's something that you know without really taking time to explore all the opportunities out there and all the different things that you could study and all the jobs you could do with it. So, and it's hard because you don't know what's out there. And so I would encourage people to take this time to explore as much as possible, to learn about all the things that you could study and all the jobs that you could have, and take advantage of the fact that you have lots of professors around you that are experts in lots of different things, and grad students who might be also exploring other options beyond academia for their life and their careers, to just consider all that's available to you so that you don't pigeonhole yourself too soon, and that you can explore things that maybe you're not aware of that would actually be something that you're really passionate about.
Thank you. I think that's great advice, and in both realms. So really great words.
Sure.
Yeah. So thank you so much for that. Thank you for this conversation, and thank you for your time.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. It's my pleasure. And thanks for all your great questions and for putting this together. I think it's a really great idea to have this series.
Thank you. And just on a total side note, you just mentioned that you didn't know about psychology. I think the whole point of this podcast is to kind of open people's minds, show that STEM isn't so scary. There's a lot out there. So
good. Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a great goal to have.
Thank you. Okay. Have an amazing rest of your day, and I'm going to let you go.
Great. Thanks. You too. Take care.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Brain Banter. This episode was produced and edited by me, Lila Bear.
Research and graphic design was done by me, Melody Fay.
Research was also done by me, Anna Sophia, and our production staff includes Sam Hutchinson.
Make sure to follow us on social media. Our Instagram is @GrayMatterCU. You can also find our episodes on YouTube by searching Brain Banter by Gray Matter CU.
And if you want to request a neuroscience professor for us to interview, you can do so at our website, graymattersjournalcu.org.
You've been listening to Brain Banter by Gray Matter CU. See you guys next week!